What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Here we are with another reaction, and in this one we are going back to when ancient India ruled the world. William Dalrymple talks to Ash Sarkar. I know I probably butchered those names, and I'm so sorry. But before we dive into this, if you guys happen to enjoy, please don't forget to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. If you'd like to support this channel by becoming a member, all you got to do is smash that join button to receive your exclusive benefits. And we are going to make this one into a two-parter since it happens to be so long. Let's dive right in.
At the moment, you can't move for books and exhibitions about the Silk Road, the overland trading corridor between Europe and China, powered by Chinese silks, gunpowder, and paper. But not to be too crude about it, ships are bigger than camels. They can carry a lot more stuff. And India, slap bang in the middle between China, West Asia and Europe, was at the centre of a massive maritime trade powered by the monsoon winds. What kind of cultural and intellectual impact did India have outside of its borders? I'm joined by William Dalrymple, author of The Golden Road, to discuss how India was at the epicentre of the ancient world. We talk about the Roman appetite for pepper, goodness gracious me, and how one lucky rhinoceros stopped Genghis Khan from conquering the subcontinent.
Are you serious? A lucky rhinoceros.
Okay, William Dalrymple, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Big pleasure.
So I had so much fun reading this book, and as I got into it...
I had a lot of fun writing it, actually, including one of the nicest 6-month-long holidays of my entire life after COVID.
No one ever says they had a nice time writing a book. Did you not have the pit of self-loathing?
Well, the nice bit, of course, is not actually writing the book, but going off on the travel before writing the book.
I feel
but
that.
it was great, because I spent kind of 20 years writing the same book about the East India Company and the Mughals, 4 different books about that. And this was a complete release into what had always been basically a hobby, something I've loved but never actually specialised in.
Okay.
And it's also sort of connected me with when I was a kid, I used to love archaeology, and I used to spend all my teen holidays on archaeological digs.
Oh, wow.
And then ended up going down another rabbit hole and studying something that would have amazed my teenage self, which was the 18th century, which I thought was very boring and very late. And
I feel that.
And this is coming back to the stuff I always loved, which is archaeology, early history, the ancient world, but with this new angle to me.
So what was the first seed of the idea for this book?
It was while I was in Angkor Wat, looking at this amazing, extraordinary religious monument, which is the largest Hindu temple in the world, but it's not in India, it's in Cambodia. And I already had my mind blown by that. And I was thinking of how would I formulate something to write, because it's so extraordinary and so unknown to us really in the West. I mean, we know the pictures, but the history is completely opaque. And while I was there, I got a WhatsApp from someone who said, "Have you seen this?" And it was a picture of this newly discovered Buddha's head, found not in India or anywhere that you'd associate with the Buddhist world, but in Egypt.
Oh, wow.
In an Isis temple, with sun rays coming out behind the Buddha's head as if it's a sort of solar deity. So some weird Roman syncretism of the Buddha and Sol Invictus or whatever, or Surya, or I mean, I don't know what's going on there. But what was, apart from being an extraordinary object in itself, the most multicultural object you could imagine, an Indian holy man depicted on white Proconnessian marble from the Marmara Sea, which is now Turkey, found in Egypt in an Isis temple. Apart from that, just in itself being an extraordinary thing.
That is absolutely extraordinary.
To see how far west Indian ideas were reaching in antiquity. While I was, in a sense, in the extreme east of Indian influence in Cambodia on the Mekong. And I suddenly thought, this is a whole world that we don't know. It's also a world, I discovered pretty quickly, which has been heavily colonized by Indian nationalist ideas. And
I feel that.
There's this long-standing idea since the 1930s that Indian influence in Southeast Asia was a military conquest. And you had what a historian called R.C. Majumdar, a brilliant historian of the day, described as Hindu colonies in Asia. Now, it's subsequently become very clear that it's actually something much more interesting, which is Hindu and Buddhist and other Indian ideas spreading very thoroughly through Southeast Asia, but without conquest.
We're going to get into that, but the first thing I guess I want to...
So I feel like the more he talks, the more I'm intrigued. So she kind of asked him basically what kind of gave him the idea to write this book. And he's talking about he's all the way out east. And this Buddhist head found in Egypt in an Isis temple, which is already so absolutely insane. But that kind of let him know like how far west, I guess, India actually like influenced while he was this far east, which is absolutely really cool. We find out that this was actually kind of a hobby of his, kind of diving into these things, as where now he got to put his all into it and like actually make a book about it, which is really cool to make your hobby something that you can absolutely put your all into. I know that I'm for sure that he absolutely loves that. And then he kind of talks about India's influence in Southeast Asia, the history, I guess formerly is known as being like through conquest, through military strength. And he's like, we get to kind of see that big influence in everything, but without conquest. So this should be interesting.
To ask you is that the title, the Golden Road, is a little bit of a misdirection because your focus is on sea lanes rather than
I'd say
overland
sea
routes.
roads.
Sea roads.
which is a legitimate usage. You can say sea roads.
But, so what does this shift of focus onto seas and ships, what does that do to the prevailing view of trade between Asia and the West during this period from the kind of, was it like 5th century BC to the medieval period?
So from the very beginning, one of the things that interested me most was why do we not know this stuff? If it's true, as I'm saying in this book, that India changed the whole face of Asia with its, not just its religious ideas, but its philosophy, its learning, its ideas of cosmology, astronomy, mathematics, dance, sculpture, this whole package of Indian stuff which spreads. If it's true that this is as important as it seems to be, how come we don't know all this? How come that this is not something that we're taught at school? How come it's not something we all know, like we know about Alexander the Great or the British Empire or the other things that we are brought up with? And there are a number of answers to that, I think. The first is colonialism. We are inheritors of an educational system that has come out of a world where, as Macaulay famously put it, a single shelf of a good English library contains more of worth than the entire native literature of India and Arabia. Now, we laugh at that now, but that
was what my head of department told me when I asked why there wasn't more Indian literature in the course. He was like, well, is there any?
Yeah, exactly. So, yes, there is a great deal, and it's extraordinary. And half the world was suckled on it. Literally, half the world's population today lives in countries where Indian ideas are now or once were dominant. So the easy answer is colonialism, because the British didn't recognise it. But it's actually only half the answer. There are other reasons why we don't know this. And I think partly it's because it's been split into different stories. That the story of Buddhism is connected with this idea of the Silk Road. The spread of Hinduism into Southeast Asia is part of the story of the spread of Sanskrit. The story of Indian mathematics, as far as it's taught at all, and the fact that the zero and the numbers we use every day are Indian, is taught in history of science or something. And these things are all curated in different departments, split up.
Okay.
And particularly at the centre of it, there is this idea which my generation got very excited by, and it was a new idea, amazingly, because it's now become so mainstream, is this idea of the Silk Road. This summer in London, there is a major exhibition, which I'll be seeing this afternoon at the British Library, and another major exhibition at the British Museum about the Silk Road, which is focused on China.
Okay.
And there are these maps you see where there's this more or less horizontal road leading from Chang'an or Xi'an, the terminus of the Silk Road on the South China Sea, on the far east of China, right through what's now Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, and it lands at Antioch or somewhere on the Mediterranean. And actually, that idea of the Silk Road, which is so dominant now, is not an ancient idea. Marco Polo doesn't talk about it. The Chinese don't talk about it. There is no mention of it before 1880, when a German colonial geographer called Baron von Richthofen, the grandfather of the First World War flying ace, the Red Baron, came up with this idea, the Seidenstraßen, which he put into a map of a potential colonial railway that he was planning to build from Berlin to what was then Peking.
So what I'm hearing is about the Silk Road. Now, I will not lie to you guys. I do not know much about the Silk Road. But I'm hoping during this video that he'll kind of talk more about it as he's talking about it now. And I'm kind of learning like the different countries that, well, the now countries of what the path was through. I'm learning that the Silk Road, I guess, is a lot less recent than most people think it is. But there was some kind of road before the Silk Road, as I assume is where he's going with this. And so I just think learning about history, learning about different topics like is really cool. And so he gets to go to the British Museum later and look at an item from the Silk Road or a representative of the Silk Road, something of the nature. And I think like him being a historian, I think he loves his job. You can kind of tell by the way he talks about it. He's absolutely fascinated by history, wants to research it, find out as much as possible. And for me, I think it's cool to just kind of hear him. And yeah, to get to learn more about history, get to learn more about the Indian influence, not just religiously, but he talks about so many areas that India has influenced Asia, and I'm sure the rest of the world. He talks about mathematics. He talks about cosmetology. There's literally so much, but he's saying all these areas like were broken down into separate stories. So I guess that's not why they're... India, I guess, is as known for like ruling the ancient world as it should be, or maybe history has been forgotten, or you guys talk to me in the comment section what you think, but I'm absolutely enjoying this right now.
A potential colonial railway that he was planning to build from Berlin to what was then Peking. And it doesn't appear in English until 1936, when a Nazi sympathizer called Sven Hedin writes a book called The Silk Road, which comes into English. And by the 1980s, when I was a kid at university, it was beginning to be propagated. And my first book was about following Marco Polo down the Silk Road. But the Silk Road, in my opinion, does not really have any reality on the ground until the Mongols smash an enormous hole through the middle of Asia in the 13th century. Before that, and particularly in the classical period, the great age of Rome of Augustus, the aftermath of Antony Cleopatra committing suicide, is that Egypt is appropriated by Rome, colonized, which gives Egypt and Roman Empire a sea border with India. Because of the monsoon winds, it only takes 2 months to sail with a sailing boat between a port on the Red Sea and a port in Kerala or a port in Gujarat or on the Indus.
I mean, this is one of the things which you write about, which is all of these luxuries which were entering into the Roman world, whether it's pepper or silks or rhubarb, which, by the way, completely fucking spun me out. Because
rhubarb and cream couldn't be more English.
There is nothing more English than rhubarb and custard. And like, my husband's from Yorkshire, and this morning I was like, "Did you know that rhubarb is from India?" And he was like, "You can't have everything."
It sounds like you've been in a kind of a Sanjeev Bhaskar sketch.
Yeah, no, I'm sick of you saying that everything is Indian.
Leonardo da Vinci, Indian.
Yeah, Indian. I mean, that was my grandmother. She's like Henry VIII, Indian.
He had Sanjeev at the launch.
Oh, really?
And I had him do and he did a very funny. I do a podcast called the Empire Podcast, and he said it is an Indian podcast called the Umpire Podcast. And then he did his own sort of bespoke sketch for.
But you've got all these Roman writers who link silk and the fact that it's so sensuous and you can see so much of a woman's body through it to this idea of, Well, we're decadent and we're weak, and look at us. We're kind of on the edge of depravity.
The specific idea that the Roman writer you're talking about is complaining about, this is Pliny. And Pliny is a very sort of familiar figure. He's that peppery colonel, or the kind of, the kind of angry admiral propping up a bar at some pub by the sea.
Oh, we've gone soft.
Yeah, and he says, why do you need all this black stuff on your food? What is this pepper that people now, the young now, put on their food? And as you said, why would we pay a fortune to bring a see-through material so that these decadent Roman matrons can show off their bodies in parties? Gemstones, we don't need them. And so his argument is that the entire wealth of the Roman world, as he says, India is a drain for all the precious metals of the world, which is a very nice sort of reverse of obviously the 18th and 19th century thing, when the West drains the wealth of India into British pockets, into all those national trust houses that now have Indian treasures inside them, like Powis Castle. But in the first century, Pliny's complaining because he says, we make all this money, we do all this work, we conquer all these countries like Gaul, and then our rich, decadent aristocracy just buy a load of nonsense from India, that pepper, cotton, silks, gemstones, something called nard, which was the basis for Roman perfume, which comes from the Himalayas. I don't know whether you know your Christian Gospels, but in the Gospel of Matthew, there's a scene where Martha massages Christ's feet with nard. And all the other disciples complain, saying that we could have just sold this and given it to the money to the poor. And you're wasting it on him. and this is a measure of how expensive this stuff is. And recently, a papyrus has turned up, which has excited all the economic historians, because it contains a detailed invoice for one consignment of goods. It's a very modern document. It's exactly what you take out if you were shipping carpets from India to Bradford today or something. And it has, in a sense, one column saying what's inside the container, another saying its value, and a third column saying the customs take that's going to have to be paid at the border for each one of these things. So it's ivory, nard, pepper, cotton, and silk. And if this one random consignment on one ship called the Hermapilon, we know the name of the ship even, if the Hermapilon had made it to Egypt and they got this crate to the Nile, shipped it up to Alexandria and sold it in Alexandria, the ship owner or whoever was behind this consignment would have been rich enough to buy one of the premier estates in Egypt or indeed central Tuscany and have enough money to join the Roman Senate. So it was clearly a highly risky enterprise to go overseas. There's pirates, there's shipwrecks, there's all manner of things that can go very badly wrong. You have to borrow money to buy this stuff in the first place. But if you get it back to Rome or to Alexandria, you are in, you're the Elon Musk of Alexandria. You're the
Elon Musk, that rich? That much? India. So it sounds like, you got this Roman general who's upset, Scrooge, angry, because god dang, India, the Rome is buying absolutely all this from India. We talking pepper, we talking silk, we talking lard, we talking so much things they're getting from India. And he's saying India is a drain on Rome. Like, all of our money is going to India. What is with this pepper? Like, why does you need to sprinkle this black stuff on their food? I mean, we all know how important pepper is. It makes food taste so much better. It takes things to a different level. So pepper is a necessity. But he's like, what's with this silk, this see-through silk that women can show their bodies, and what do we need this for? We don't need any of this, right? But that's absolutely kind of crazy. And then the fact that it's that dangerous. It's that risky. The fact, if you take this consignment or if you go to India to get this consignment and get it back to Rome, you will become like the Elon Musk of Alexandria. You will be so freaking wealthy enough to buy one of the premier estates. Like, that's absolutely insane. That is that dangerous. But that India, the stuff that they are getting from India is that valuable to them. how much? What was the value on the goods? He talked about each column having a value for how much the silk was, how much the pepper was, how much the lard was, how much. What's the value? Because I wish he would. If he does tell us the value, I hope he'll explain it like in today's terms too. This is absolutely fascinating. Dang. So we kind of see, like, hearing how India built that wealth, that they were the richest country on earth. I think we've heard in different videos they own like 1/3, or 1/3 of the world's GDP. Like, they were legit that rich, and even higher than that, some believe. So we kind of seeing that India had India had everything. India had everything, and everybody was buying from India, and India had all that gold as well. Like, jeez. Okay, let's continue. I'm so into this.
And you do it twice, then you can buy up half of Rome.
What was Indian seafaring technology like at this time? Because this is me trying to remember from my Mike Duncan History of Rome podcast, which is where I get all of my information from, which is the Romans basically...
I like the ancients.
Yeah, like, about the ancients, also about everything. From my understanding, the Romans reverse engineer, basically. Is it a Phoenician ship? They reverse engineer.
Very good, Ash. Very good.
Yes. I did English literature, so I only know about the Phoenicians from T.S. Eliot. So, like, reverse engineer a Phoenician ship, and that's kind of how they end up with, like, decent enough seafaring technology to, take over the Mediterranean. How does India's seafaring technology match up? Is it that they've got all this stuff, so they don't need to be that good at seafaring technology, the ships will come to them? Or did they have decent enough seafaring technology that they could then expand southeast?
So there's two answers to that. One is that clearly Indians were very proud of their seafaring technology. We have pictures of Indian boats in the Ajanta caves and on coins. But the reality is that unlike quite a lot of other places like Singapore and that, which have invested money in marine archaeology, which is quite a sort of rich man's game. You have to have a sub and go down and lift this stuff up. And to be honest, the ASI, the Archaeological Survey of India, hasn't simply not put the money in to bring the shipwrecks that we know are there up and examine them. So there's a lot we don't know about ancient Indian seafaring technology. But what we do know is that India had an incredible gift just by its position, geography and meteorology. Now that gift is the fact that the Tibetan plateau ices over every winter and cold winds rake in. Then it thaws in the spring and summer, and hot winds blow out. Now that sort of bellows movement, if you like, above India, creates the monsoon winds every year, which blow fast in one direction, westwards from the west coast, eastwards from the east coast, for 6 months, and then neatly reverse, so they can blow you back again. So if you're an Indian sailor, you've only really got to put up a sail and build a very basic sort of canoe, even with an outrig, little outrigger like you get in the Goan fishing boats. And in 2 months' time, you're in Egypt. Then you have to wait a few months for the winds to reverse. And in August, you get back on your boat and you get sucked back all the way to India at speed. 2 months. While it would take 3 years from a camel caravan to go all the way plodding through Persia, and the Himalayas, and what have you.
And would you say that that's kind of the material basis for the spread of Indian culture, religion, commodities? It's that bellows movement.
And that has meant that on the Indian coast, you've always had these trading communities, which in the 19th century, with the British Empire, end up in Kenya and the Swahili coast and everything. But before that, you have long-distance traders since the time of antiquity. Archaeologists have found that when they were poking around with the corpse of poor Ramesses II, which is perfectly preserved, they found grains of Indian pepper up his nose.
Oh, wow.
Are you serious?
As part of the mummifying process. But that came from India.
Oh, I thought he was doing like lines
He
of
was
pepper.
snorting
pepper. Yeah, oh, God, I'm really feeling it. I mean, for this time period that
I ain't been sneezing like crazy, dog. Pure sneeze.
talking about in this book, how much sense does it make to talk about India at all? Because you've got multiple kingdoms, multiple languages. Is there a sense amongst people living on the subcontinent that they're part of something bigger? Or was there a sense of what the what their identity was, what the polity was, limited to the boundaries of that kingdom?
Very important question, and there are very clear answers to, because it's something that's much
And I think before he go ahead and answer that, I just want to kind of talk about, I think it's really cool, like, yeah, I'm not a sailor, I don't know how to sail, I don't know when to set the sail, where to set the sail, where to do this, when to do that, but the fact that, like, Camelback, it takes 3 years for these things to get from one place to another, yet he said the geography that India had, it had an advantage of geography and everything. So all they really had to do was build a decent enough ship and then set a sail. And the first 6 months, take it where you need to go. Take you west, I believe he said, or east, depending on where you start. And then all you gotta do, sit there. You get there in 2 months' time compared to 3 years. Absolutely mind blowing. And sit there and wait for the winds to shift directions and pull you back into India. And once they do, you're back in 2 months' time, which is absolutely fascinating. I'm sure at some point in the future, India will be able to, like, put more resources into going down and picking up some of those shipwrecks, and we get to learn more about like ancient India shipfaring technology and how great the ships were. So that should be exciting whenever India does that, and we're capable of kind of seeing more about that. As to, it seems like, where we know more about shipfaring techniques of other countries from the way they make it sound. And so, bro, I'm like, India had it all. I mean, like, that was the place to be. That was the most profitable country. It sounded like the greatest country on earth. Ancient times was definitely India.
Discussed. India, unlike China, which for most of its history, remarkably, is a centralized state with a civil service that operates over the entire width of, not quite modern China, but certainly the central Han heartlands. Mm-hmm. India, in contrast, is, with rare exceptions, as you say, a fractured multiplicity of different kingdoms. There are brief moments during the Mauryans, under Ashoka, again under Chandragupta and the Guptas, again under the Delhi Sultanate, and once again, finally, under the Mughals, when a lot of India is united. But it's moments. In general, it's disunited. And when the famous Chinese monk Xuanzang comes over, he, according to his rights, enters India at Jalalabad, which is now in Afghanistan. And he says, I'm entering India, a region of 70 countries.
Oh.
So he regards it as a very clearly defined region, not as a political unit, but as a region.
Okay.
And from the time of Alexander the Great, he arrives in what's now Pakistan, and he meets all these holy men in Taxila. They sound actually like Jains rather than Hindus because they're naked, which sounds like a Digambara Jain. But whatever they were, the Greeks call them gymnosophists, which doesn't help us understand much more in modern terms. But whoever these holy men were, they give a very clear definition of India, which is one that the British get given 1,000 years later or 2,000 years later. That India is bounded on one side by the Indus, on the other side by the Ganges, and on the south side by the sea. Mm-hmm. And that's in the Mahabharata as the extent of the lands of Bharata. So that definition of the geographical spread of India from Indus to Ganges, from Ganges to the Kanyakumari and back again is pretty consistent. And there's a very clear image of India as a united holy land, but it's very rarely one political unit.
Okay. And so, I mean, like, forgive me for being really Eurocentric, because when I, in my head, thought about Alexander the Great reaching India, the story that you're always told is that it's like summiting Everest, right? Like, look how far this guy went. And you don't really think, well, what was that encounter like? So when Alexander the Great encounters India and Indians for the first time, does he think that he's encountering barbarians? Does he think of it as like a lesser culture than, the Hellenic one he's coming from?
Well, whether it's lesser or greater, I mean, the Greeks, as as mass conquerors, always regarded everyone else as barbaroi, as
Of course.
barbarians.
You kind of have to in order to conquer them.
But that doesn't, in a sense, but they also regarded they also regarded the Persians as barbarians. So that's not it's not like they're actually saying these guys are just sort of woolly savages. It just mean they're different.
Okay.
No, the Alexander, we have a very clear set of images of what India was like for the Macedonians, and they are amazed principally by its wealth. It's a very rich land, they say, which is why it's so frustrating for Alexander when his soldiers then say, we want to go home. They fought the one battle against Porus on the Jhelum in the Punjab, and they then say, right, that's it, we're off back home, we've had enough. And Alexander is aware, and he sits down and weeps, because he realizes that the richest conquest is still ahead, and he's never going to make it. So from...
That's crazy. So Alexander the Great wanted to go and conquer India because he saw the wealth of India, and they were all amazed by the wealth of India. But all the soldiers were like, after they completed their first conquest, they're like, we want to go home. And that's completely understandable because, I mean... Wealth to many people isn't always in the form of money. Wealth is family. Wealth is time, and so they're like, we finished this conquest. We've done all this fighting. We've spent all this time away from our families. Like, we want to go back home. I get it. And Alexander's standing there crying like, no, like the riches, the wealth of this land. Like we can't stop here. We have to conquer India, but his soldiers sounds like don't really care about that. They just want to go home, which again I cannot blame them. It sounds like India was a very big land, but never like under one banner. He said there were pockets of time where you had certain rulers, but for the most part, a lot of the time it sounds like India was a land full of, like, I believe someone said 70 different countries. So it was like different rules and regulations and laws throughout each country, I assume, and you had different politics throughout each part of India. So it was never like, I guess China for the most part has always been like a central state, and where there was like either one ruler or somebody was calling all the shots for the entire land of China. It doesn't sound like it was the same in India. So let's continue.
The richest conquests are still ahead, and he's never going to make them. So from that period, there has always been there lodged in the European mind that this is a very, very rich country.
I mean, you have as a consequence of Alexander the Great reaching India, you've got Sikandar being an Indian name, which is, again, to go back to the Sanjeev Bhaskar sketch, is like Alexander the Great, Indian. I mean, what from the Indian side, what did they think they were encountering when they're encountering the Greeks?
Well, that's the great joke, is that there's no record of the Greeks at all in Indian sources. It's partly because there are very few ancient Indian sources from that period, but it is significant that in the Mahabharata or something, there's not a single reference. You do get later inscriptions from the Buddhist period talking about Yavanas, and there are Tamil poems about Yavana mercenaries and Yavana merchants, and there are inscriptions about Yavanas who convert to Buddhism and dedicate pillars or gateways at Buddhist temples. But there's no sense of reverse excitement, if you said. It isn't like, we've suddenly encountered the Europeans, yippee! The Europeans are far more excited to discover the Indians than vice versa.
Well, it's like one of those things like the Battle of Lepanto. Very, very big deal for Europeans. You ask like a Turk about it, they're like, we've never heard of it. Like, not a big deal for us. Like,
so exactly that. And what you then get is, after, you said you're a literature student, after Cleopatra puts her asp to her bosom and the suicide of Anti-Cleopatra, Octavius Caesar conquers Egypt. Within a generation, a geographer from Alexandria makes a trip with the governor of Egypt to the top of the Red Sea, and he says, from the port of Myos Hormuz, which we know is not the biggest port, incidentally, on the Red Sea, from this one port, 250 ships a year sail in a fleet to India with the monsoon winds.
God
and so if you then add the other big port, Berenike, to that, then we're talking 500 cargo ships a year going backwards and forwards with these winds.
And what would the equivalent be in camels, right? To compare the overland to the sea route, like one ship, how many camels would that be for a caravan?
Oh, I mean, sort of, 3,000, 5,000. I can't give you the exact
Your
figure,
ship to
but
camel
yeah.
conversion chart.
we need a firm app for this to sort out our conversion rates. But camels obviously can only carry what their saddlebags can fill, and a big seagoing ship of the Roman sort, and particularly the ones in Berenike we know from the births are called elephantine ships because they were made to transport elephants, which is one of the other imports. They used them for the elephants, tigers, and rhinoceroses, as you'll see in Gladiator 2 when it comes out next week.
I want to see Gladiator 2. I got to see Gladiator 2.
So these are big ships, and you can get a lot of ivory. I mean, we don't like to think of it today because of our fears about the extinction of elephants and so on, but that was probably the biggest item of trade of all.
I mean, I really want to talk about the spread of Buddhism. What parallels could you draw between the spread of Buddhism and the spread of Christianity through the Roman Empire? Because it sort of seems to me there's something, similar, which is this starts out as sort of a rejection of the contemporary power structure and hierarchy, and then suddenly it becomes a religion of the court. Like how?
So very.
I know y'all looking at me praying to get right there, and it is getting so good because I want to hear the answer to how Buddhism, Christianity, how it started to spread through the Roman Empire. But we got to end it. I think the fact that there are about 500 cargo ships going back and forth between India and different places using the winds are absolutely fascinating. Ancient India, from everything that he said, is absolutely fascinating. A land full of absolute wealth. They had everything that other countries needed and wanted. It sounds like a land that Alexander the Great wanted to conquest but didn't quite reach it. Everything they're talking about is truly fascinating, and learning about ancient India. And I've reacted to so many videos at this point. I feel like learning about India is just such a cool topic. It's such a cool country. Like when you go back into history, and it just fascinates me. But that's all we got for this one. We'll get to part 2 next time. If you enjoyed, please don't forget to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, check out the next one, and I'll see you guys next time.